The Elusive Mystery of Consciousness, a Radical Moderate Exploration. Hey folks, welcome back. Let's start with a sharp dichotomy here. A dichotomy that has existed in the world ever since we became conscious of our surroundings and then began to ask the fundamental questions of existence from ourselves. I'm talking about the dichotomy between the realm of matter, which is the physical things, that are all around us, whether it's particles, rocks, mountains, and galaxies, and then the other realm, which is the realm of thoughts and ideas and perceptions. Now, science has mapped the laws of physics. It has unraveled the genetic code, as well as even beginning to manipulate the fabric of reality through artificial intelligence and quantum computing. And yet, the most intimate and immediate thing that we all know about our personal experiences perpetually, which is our own consciousness, it remains elusive. So we've taken leaps and bounds in understanding the material world, but are still completely ignorant in many ways, for the most part at least, about this realm of consciousness. Well, let's start by defining some terms over here, okay? Because this is an area that's riddled with misunderstanding. I think that the most common definition of consciousness in neuroscience and also probably philosophy nowadays that I've come across is that phenomena that constitutes our subjective experience. That distinct feeling of being conscious, of representing, and then also representing our representations, which means reflecting on ourselves, is a pretty good definition of it. I know that definition seems to be also lacking in some kind of a profound or revelatory way, but it also leads to what philosopher David Chalmers called the hard problem of consciousness, which is, what does it really feel like to be conscious?
So the brain is just a big physical system. The universe is a giant physical system. To simulate the universe, at the very least, you're going to have to simulate the brains as well as all the other physical systems within it.
And historically, philosophers have referred to this as the problem of other minds, also the problem of qualia, which is like the redness of red, for example, or basically what Thomas Nagel was referring to when he asked the famous question of what is it like to be a bat? We can only know what is it like to be a bat as a human, but what does it really feel to be a bat as a bat? There seems to be a barrier there for us to understand. Unfortunately, despite our general definition of the term and the kind of much advancements in neuroscience and cognitive science over the past century, we still don't have a definitive theory of consciousness. Of course, there are several contenders, and most likely each one is probably partially right. I'll go through some of these theories in some future videos, but despite these theories, consciousness still remains a true mystery in many ways. So before we do some more radical integrative thinking on this channel, which is what we tend to do, talk about philosophy, physics, economics, psychology, or politics, let's first kind of take a deeper look into this fundamental lens through which all integration takes place. Let's review the very main set of philosophies that are present currently on consciousness itself. So not only because it's important, but because most importantly, if we don't know what we know, then how can we trust what we think we know? 4 main views on consciousness. Okay, so from my reading and research in this specific area, and also keep in mind that I'm not really a scholar in cognitive psychology, neuroscience, or philosophy of mind. I'm a healthcare provider. I've taken my share of courses on neuroscience and also studying the brain during my pre-doc and postdoctoral training. And while I was also a head and neck anatomy tutor and instructor at our medical school for a few years, holding many actual brains, bare brains in my hands, I'm still an amateur, but I have a curious mind, a passion for philosophy of mind specifically, and also I'm constantly trying to kind of integrate knowledge and information to build holistic pictures of the world as I see it. So in this video, what I'll do is I'll try to do my best of summarizing what I've learned on this topic over time, as I've really boiled ideas down to 4 main philosophies of consciousness. Of course, you can easily say that there are as many theories or models of consciousness as there are conscious beings on this earth. But these are, in my opinion, the big, large categories on the subject matter that I could come up with. By the way, if you feel there's another major category that I kind of somehow missed, please make sure you comment below and let me know. Panpsychism, the conscious universe. Okay, so one of the oldest theories around is Panpsychism, which is something that dates all the way back to the Indian Vedas, to Buddhism, and also the history of spirituality in the world. And the idea here is that consciousness is fundamental. This, of course, means that consciousness is a property of the universe, like mass, charge, or gravity that we see and observe. According to this view, everything has some degree of consciousness or awareness, be it a particle or a bacterium or a human being. So Panpsychism says that consciousness is a property of matter, and it represents, as a matter of degree, starting all the way from subatomic particles, it's the smallest scale, and the tiniest bit of consciousness, and then that information kind of builds in their subatomic particles and then scales all the way up to the universe itself. We are at this middle scale and enjoy this level of consciousness based on the total consciousness of our being. So all the difference is a matter of degree in complexity and integration of the consciousness that is kind of all around us in the universe. And these are the kind of people, the kind of a Buddhist mantra of make me one with the universe. It's one great consciousness, and it kind of breaks down all the way to the level of the atom. Now, this idea obviously is kind of a pretty simple and intuitive and easy to explain, if you will, and that's probably why it's so appealing to so many people. It's easy to understand it, right? I mean, everything is conscious, and it's just a little bit of a degree. But by extending consciousness to all matter, you basically don't have to find an explanation for why we humans are particularly more conscious compared to a nearby mountain. But I think that is really the problem of this philosophy, because why is it then that we, which are a smaller amount of matter, are more conscious than a mountain? Now, of course, this leads to some really interesting ideas, and at the risk of totally losing you guys at this little segment here, I'm going to share with you some of the interesting facts that I have gathered over the years that will help you integrate and understand this big picture understanding and this big scale of our universe. Okay, so you all know about the human cell, right? I mean, so the human cell is made up of roughly 50 to 100 trillion atoms. And then the human body itself is made up of about 50 to 100 trillion cells. So that scales up, right? Interestingly enough, the roughly 100 billion neurons that are present in our brain, which is equal to the number of stars in the Milky Way galaxy, coincidentally here, each make about 1,000 connections with other neurons, creating about 100 trillion axonal connections inside the brain that creates this dense network of interconnection in an analog format in our brain. So as another little interesting side note for you guys, that the most sophisticated AI models that we currently have only make about 1 trillion connections in terms of their neural networks, right? So the brain makes 100 times more connections, but runs at 30 watts, which is just a fraction of what our AI models are running. So what's really unique about our brain is that it's such an efficient computational model that creates this, this level of complexity that we call consciousness. And that also we are still very far away from the energy efficiency of the brain when it comes to our AI models and our computational models. But let's not get off the subject matter here. Let's go back to Panpsychism. So this idea obviously has gained some traction in modern discussions, particularly among physicists like Roger Penrose, who argues that consciousness might be woven into the fabric of quantum mechanics. As I said before, what's nice about Panpsychism is that it creates uniformity in the answer to the question of consciousness. But for many people, including myself, to be honest with you, Panpsychism just feels too broad, and it just feels like confusing the word consciousness with information. It is true that according to the quantum realm, all particles and subatomic particles carry some level of information, but that's not the same as the substrate or as consciousness itself. And if we don't really substitute the word and call everything conscious, then doesn't that really take the word consciousness to its eventual meaning, which is kind of like what we saw with postmodernism as a movement in art that kind of destroyed art because it said everything is art. And it means that if everything is art, then what is art? It loses its meaning, right? So in that case, if everything is conscious, then what is consciousness? It loses its essential qualitative meaning, the way we express it from our own internal world. So I'll probably get into a lot of that stuff in future videos, okay? Anyway, if you are interested in learning more about panpsychism and also the notion that consciousness is fundamental to the universe, you can really read the book Lights Out by Annika Harris that does a fairly good job with the subject matter. Dualism, the two-world model. All right, so I said earlier that we have historically dichotomized the world into that of matter and ideas. The separation into these distinct realms is really a classic dualistic model, and it was originally championed by René Descartes when he argued that there are two distinct realms, the material world and then the world of the mind. And you can study physics through materialism, but if you're really talking about thoughts and ideas, well, classical physics, it just ain't gonna cut it. Now, in Descartes' view, consciousness is not just reducible to physical processes, but it exists as something separate, a whole separate realm, perhaps even supernatural. So where do these two realms interact? It's really not clear, but Descartes kind of thought that and hypothesized that this will happen through the pineal gland, which is a little tiny gland in the base of the brain. But we now know, obviously, through neuroscience that that's not the case, and the function of the pineal gland is not really what Descartes thought. But dualism has historically been kind of a most popular model, as like panpsychism. It's also somewhat intuitive, right? We kind of all kind of know that there is kind of a matter and then the mind. We can experience the mind, and matter is very different than that. It's also been the basis of all of our faiths, whether it's Christian, Muslim, or Judaism. This existence of soul as separate from the body, that could live after death and then also persist in afterlife, has been a repeating theme. And the idea of separating the mind from matter was that concept that they call the ghost within the machine. So that's what dualism is. And it's, as I said, it's kind of an intuitive perspective for many people, particularly those that are a little bit of religious background, and it's helpful in apologetics. But this theory also struggles under the rigor of modern neuroscience because it has found clear correlations between actual brain activity and conscious states, as shown by studying patients that have had brain injuries or strokes. And it means that if the mind and the body are truly separate, then why is it that changes in the brain, whether it's brain injury or drugs even, or disease, can so profoundly alter our consciousness? The conclusion from the effect of the mind-altering drugs, for example, psychedelics and so on, in my opinion actually, is that the mind is what the brain does, right? That should be the conclusion, because our reality manifests as a result of the chemical kind of interactions in our brain, and they can be significantly altered with the addition of a single chemical orally or so on. And I should know this, as I have been to Burning Man 4 or 5 times. Anyway, if our consciousness is altered so drastically by a single chemical, then there has to be a physical basis to our mind's perception that interacts with this specific chemical. So dualism is currently faith-based, but the scientific evidence points at a physical brain as the source of our consciousness as we know it. And that's just driven by the neuroscience experiments. If you want to read further about this dualist view, probably I'd refer you to any of the religious texts or Pensées by René Descartes. But certainly, if you read the Bible, Quran, or the Old Testament, you'll get a sense of dualism. Emergentism, the complexity threshold. Now, a more scientific approach to consciousness suggests something that I believe to be the more moderate position between this physicalism and pure idealism. And among these theories, and of course as the radical moderate, as you guessed it, yes, it's probably the one that I'm intuitively gravitating towards as probably the more accurate representation of the truth. So this theory basically posits that unlike what panpsychism says, that all matter is conscious, or that there are two distinct realms of matter and spirit, like the dualists say, what we actually call consciousness is an emergent phenomenon that is arising from a sufficient level of organized complexity by biological networks that give rise to this experience of self-awareness or consciousness. This basically means that individual neurons on their own are not conscious, but when billions of them interconnect in a highly structured and specific way, something remarkable happens. Consciousness emerges from this pattern of organization. As the late philosopher of mind Daniel Dennett referred to it, purposeless individual termites using simple rules can give rise to complex structures like termite mounts. Here, the mind emerges as a result of the collective processes of billions of analog biological neurons. And it's secondary to complexity theory, probably chaos theory, information theory, network and system theory, and also the theory of evolution that hones this pattern in just perfectly so that this emergence can occur as a result of these analog interactions. So that there are scales of complexity, and at one specific level, consciousness emerges from a system following a simple set of underlying computational rules, and that's a key thing here. I like to think of it as a kind of like an operating system application that can arise from a series of zeros and ones and a set of transistors that code embedded in the underlying software that is supported by a physical hardware. So unlike panpsychism, consciousness arises as a threshold of complexity is achieved. And this is the model that I personally find kind of most convincing. It makes the most sense to me. And consciousness emerges from a complex neural networks that process information, that filters sensory input from our surrounding, and the phenomena of the subjective experience is kind of emerges from all of this. So I can talk obviously much longer about this and the specific theory and have it related to other ones and kind of as it overlaps with them. But because of the sake of time, I don't want this video to be too long. I will probably make another video next where I will spend a little bit more time talking about the different set of theories that are currently present that deal with the specific philosophy as it relates to consciousness. So stick around and subscribe if you want to see that. Idealism. Only consciousness is real. Okay, the last but not least theory of consciousness is even stranger than the other three. To sum it up, what we've really gone over so far is that we first said that all matter has kind of varying degrees of consciousness. So matter is conscious. We then said that consciousness is kind of a separate stuff from matter. So materialism and idealism are distinct entities. That's what we call the dualistic view of the world. We then modified by saying that no, we need a sufficient amount of organized matter before consciousness can arise, like an emergent phenomenon. And now let's take a quick look at the other extreme of the spectrum, meaning that matter doesn't even exist and that everything is basically just consciousness. This is a view that is known as idealism. Now, don't get confused. Unlike Panpsychism, this theory doesn't say matter is conscious. It just says matter as we know it only exists in our consciousness, and that matter is a construct, if you will, that we describe through our consciousness. And some notable folks, including Immanuel Kant, even Hegel, which I mentioned in a previous video here on dialectics, and even Plato, through his allegory of the cave, have subscribed to different versions of idealism, as there are a bunch of different versions of this thing. And let's just be clear, as the result of limitations of language and also a coordinate place that we can get all this information integrated and agree on terms, there are a lot of confusion about these terms. So idealism may mean different things to different people. But it basically argues that only consciousness exists and that what we call matter is merely a construct of our perception. And this is the philosophical position supported by thinkers like Berkeley and also some interpretations of quantum reality or quantum physicists that say reality does not even exist independently of the observer, which kind of doesn't make sense, right? Because if the wave function requires an observer, then who's doing the observing? And this is also an interesting idea that was put forth in the Plato's allegory of the cave, where the real world is separate from that of our perceptions, but our perceptions are essentially all we have to go through, and that's our consciousness. In fact, I would personally describe objective reality approaching that which kind of multiple minds, separate minds, would commonly agree on, as there are no way to process reality otherwise. My main problem with idealism is that in my mind, I can walk through walls, right? But in reality, I use doors. So I have come to a conclusion intuitively that there is a physical world out there that is imposing its limits, its resistance, and on my desires and on my imagination. And Ian McGilchrist, whose book, Matter of Things, and also this other book, The Master and Its Emissary, is a real great book, kind of explains to this concept, explains it as the resistance of objects. Of course, some of the more extreme versions of idealism can lead to some kind of bizarre implications, but these are actually non-refutable theories, such as that the world is a simulation and that we're all living in here and interacting in consciousness instead of living in an actual physical world. The whole thing is simulated. It's totally nuts, but it cannot be refuted. This was really the basis for the movie Matrix, and even though intriguing, this perspective really raises kind of more questions than it answers, in my opinion. If everything is just perception, then who or what is really doing the perceiving, right? Does that lead to Descartes' idea of dualism? I think, therefore I am, which means just like in the movie Matrix, there is someone that is doing the thinking where the simulation is occurring in their mind. It also makes kind of scientific investigation really difficult. After all, if nothing is truly objective, then how can we verify anything, right? I mean, are we just verifying the boundaries of the simulation? It's kind of like a Truman Show. Lastly, if the whole thing is a simulation, I have totally wasted a whole bunch of time, reading books and reviewing and doing some research and putting these ideas together on the subject matter for you guys to share them with you, whereas you don't even exist, right? I mean, you are, by this definition, a figment of my imagination. You are a construct. You don't even exist. Or what if I don't exist and I am a figment of your imagination? I mean, see, it leads to a lot of spooky thoughts, right? So what if we all live in the Matrix or the Truman Show? And these are the implications that can arise as idealism. So it's interesting, cool, makes for great science fiction movies, but there has to be some kind of a world outside of us, as in my opinion, we see people come and go in this world, right? People have consciousness and don't have consciousness, and that there's a continuity, unless we decide that the whole thing is simulated and is a lie, which we really cannot refute. If you want more information on this, watch the movie Matrix or Truman Show, two of my favorite movies. Gödel's theorem, the mathematics of incompleteness. Now, no scientific theory is ever complete if we don't inject a little bit of fun mathematics or abstraction into it, right? After all, mathematics is the language of science, and that mathematicians have strived for the past millennia to model the world, claiming, along with physicists, that the universe is rationally intelligible through a bunch of equations and directed observations. Now, this has been really the basis of fundamental physics and what physicists call beauty in their equations. Symmetry and breaking the symmetry, that's really what string theory and the M theory is all about, right? These are the standard kind of ideas that are now at the basis of fundamental physics. But while there are limitations to understanding the world of fundamental physics through mathematics, how about consciousness? Can mathematics explain consciousness? Now, the race to explain the world through mathematics was struck a big blow in the 1930s when a mathematician named Kurt Gödel described what later became known as Gödel's incompleteness theorem. It's a mathematical theorem in which basically says roughly along the lines of, translated in my language, into something like a system cannot understand or solve itself from within. And all of us can relate to this within the old adage of thinking outside the box, right? Everybody's heard about that. Basically, the fish in the fishbowl is unable to fathom the world on the outside of the bowl, and that to solve a problem, we have to use a different set of axiomatic frameworks than the ones that we used when we created the problem, which is that famous Einstein quote, right? That we cannot solve our problems with the same thinking that we used when we created them. So, according to Gödel's theorem, it's theoretically inconceivable that we can solve problems outside the box when we are inside the box. So, it follows then from his theorem that a self-referential system like consciousness, a system that represents its representations like the mind does, can never really be able to understand itself from within the limitations of its own consciousness, and that we somehow need to operate at a level above our consciousness, something that's impossible before we can understand the phenomenon of consciousness. And a good example of this is this hierarchy of systems order, which was recently in an article by Francesca Krechilova in the journal Medium, where she uses the kind of Matryoshka nested Russian dolls as a model of understanding Gödel's theorem. And that made a lot of sense to me. And here, each doll can only be aware of the inner dolls it carries, but not really of the higher scales of dolls that it's nested within. So that information outside the system is always and forever beyond its axis. It cannot access. And that is the basis of Gödel's theorem. Another good book that I would recommend for you to read is the classic Gödel-Escher-Bach by Douglas Hofstadter, which is really an epic book in understanding consciousness and the world. Conclusion. Now that I have confused everyone with all of my tangential rants, let's sum up the whole thing once again. Okay, I tried to do a cursory review of the 4 dominant theories of consciousness, which is Panpsychism, Dualism, Emergentism, with the mind as an emergent phenomenon of the brain, and then lastly, the wild idea of idealism. I then went over how Gödel's theorem creates a potentially hard barrier into understanding consciousness for us beyond describing its parts. Essentially, the hard problem of consciousness that David Chalmers talked about, and the fact that it will remain a perpetual internal barrier for us to solve. Or maybe the whole thing about our conscious experience is just a linguistic limitation in expressing the subjective experience through words. We don't have the language and the vocabulary to fully explain this, just as our ancestors did not either. So the development of language, in my personal opinion, is a significant component of a rise in consciousness, which we see not present also in corollary animals. So language is key too. Anyway, this remains a mystery and I'm starting to get a headache here. But look, I know one thing, and that is that no one really knows how consciousness works with any degree of certainty. And anyone who tells you otherwise or says that they are certain is either expressing their ego or demonstrating their illusion. Any real knowledge in this area is an expression of dogma, religious or scientific. Okay, this video has gotten so long in the tooth here. I'm going to make a couple of additional parts to this where I will spend a little bit more time talking about emergentism, which I kind of agree with, and also why I find this theory more plausible. And then also I'm going to make a third video where I go over some of the history of thought in the area of consciousness. After all, you might be wondering, where did all of these ideas come from, and how did we arrive to where we have on this fundamental topic of consciousness? How did a caveman making a hand axe develop computational fluid dynamic equations or a Lorentz attractor? All right, basically, what's the history of thought regarding consciousness across cultures and thinking traditions? All right, if you're still conscious after watching this whole video, make sure that you subscribe so that you don't miss any of the next videos that are going to be coming up on this topic. And also, until the next time, stay conscious, stay radical, and stay moderate.